Thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? For centuries, this question has intrigued and baffled scholars and laypeople alike. To help us explore the question and answer the question, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Dr. Douglas Petrovich of the Bible Seminary joins us for a two-part episode. We'll be talking about the Exodus Pharaoh. Doug, welcome to Digging for Truth. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Henry. It's great to be with you here today.
Well, we're excited to have you on the program for the first time, and we hope to do more with you and draw on your expertise. Now, speaking of that, since you are coming on for the first time, what I always like to do is give our guests a chance to tell the audience a little bit of their backstory so they get to know you a little bit. So I'd like you to do that. Could you share with the audience for a little bit, give them a brief bio of your background and your passions?
Sure, Henry. Definitely, my passion is walking with the Lord. I mean, that's number one, and loving all of God's people and building into them through discipleship. So that's pretty much, the heart and soul of who I am. And God's really guided me into this area of biblical history and biblical archaeology, which has become just a great area of passion, and I've loved to learn everything I have, and really it's exciting because I'm constantly realizing how little I know, and so I'm trying to learn more all the time. But I received a Bachelor of Arts degree at the Moody Bible Institute in evangelism, and then after that I did a Master of Theology and a Master of Divinity at the Master's Seminary, which is in Southern California. And then after teaching for 10 years, we built a seminary from scratch in Siberia, Russia. And in those 10 years, we then trained the people who took it over for us. So now they're teaching and administrating where we were before. And so that freed me up to come back to the Northern Hemisphere. So I went to Toronto and I did an MA and a PhD. My area of major in my PhD is Syro-Palestinian archaeology. And then I have a first minor in ancient Egyptian language, so that you would know that as hieroglyphics, so that's Middle and Late Egyptian. And then my second minor is in ancient Near Eastern religions.
Well, that's wonderful, and we should tell the audience that you and I met each other in Israel at the Hatzor excavations in 2007. And so that is our connection, goes all the way back to that period of time. So as part of your story, God exiled you to Siberia, huh? So you had to learn how to speak Russian.
Exactly. And, I was also asked not only to launch the seminary where I was academic dean and I taught, but I was asked to be a church planting pastor. So I had to learn Russian quickly so that I could get to the place where I could preach on my own. So by the time I left, I was excited that I was actually preaching right into Russian with my Greek Bible in my hands, going straight from Greek to Russian with no helps in any of the other languages. So that was pretty much the greatest thrill I had over there.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I can certainly say you're a better man than me when it comes to that. That is fantastic. Well, one of your passions over the years is obviously your minor in Egyptology and in terms of studying the hieroglyphic language, is this question of the Exodus and the Exodus Pharaoh in particular. Now, you and I agree, and the Ministry of ABR and you agree that the date of the Exodus should be 1446 BC, and we've laid that out in other episodes. We'll refer that audience to that. But what we want to do is situate that date in Egyptian history. This is called the New Kingdom period, and specifically the 18th dynasty. Why don't we set the stage a little bit for what's happening in that time period leading up to the events of the Exodus, if you would, please, Doug.
Sure, Henry. But let's start a little bit earlier, a lot earlier, in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. That's the dynasty that's connected to Joseph. And all of this is going to be coming out in my new book that's actually really close to publication. It's called Origins of the Hebrews, New Evidence for Israelites in Egypt, from Joseph to the Exodus. And there I build the case for the occupation that the Israelites had there in Egypt in the Nile Delta at a site called Avaris. And I'm not the first to connect Israelites to Avaris. There are many people, Bryant Wood included, in that line who make that connection. But what happened in the 12th dynasty in Joseph's day is that there was this increase in the size of the Israelites. And they were engaged in a couple of industries. One was a turquoise mining industry down in Sinai. That's one. But the one that really became the staple for them, believe it or not, and whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, is a lucrative trading industry with wine. So wine that was made in Canaan was exported in large jars called Canaanite jars and sent to Avaris, where it was distributed throughout Egypt. So the Israelites essentially became middlemen. They became players in this trade. And obviously, that it would have been extremely lucrative for them, especially when we realize that Manfred Betok, who was for over 40 years, the chief excavator at Avaris, he concluded that in the time of the second millennium BC, when this trade went on between Avaris and Canaan, over 2 million jars, 2 million Canaanite jars, found their way into Avaris and were dispersed, which means 14 jars per day were coming in. So this is the industry that God allowed the Israelites to participate in, which really made them big players in the ancient world, and especially in Egypt.
And it sounds like a thriving group of people during this time until we get to the events that are recorded in the book of Exodus. Now, we have just about a minute to finish up the segment, believe it or not. Maybe you could set the stage for that for us, Doug, as we go into the next segment, if you would, please.
Sure. In about 1668 or BC or so, the Hyksos came in to Avaris, and they lived among the Israelites, and they essentially were Asiatics who were more warring people than the Israelites. The Israelites were just very domesticated and not really interested in warfare. The Hyksos came. They lived there for about 108 years, according to the ancient Egyptian records. And during that time, they probably had a very good relationship with the Israelites. And then there's this Pharaoh that we read about in Exodus 1 called the Pharaoh who did not know of Joseph. And that almost certainly was a man named Amenhotep. He was the last king of Dynasty 17, the first king of Dynasty 18. And what he did is he moved his troops from southern Egypt, which is the higher half of Egypt, downward or northward into the Nile Delta. And they invaded and they pushed back the Hyksos all the way to Avaris and basically eventually eliminated their kingdom and chased them out. And the remnants of the Hyksos moved to Canaan, and they lived there for 3 years. And it's during this moment that the Pharaoh who does not know of Joseph says that we need to do something with these Israelites lest they join themselves to our enemies and come and attack us. So the fear was that the Israelites would leave Egypt, go to Canaan, join up with the Asiatic Hyksos there, and then come back and attack.
Well, that's a very good summary, Doug. Thank you for that. And friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back after this break.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Douglas Petrovich, and we're talking about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, Doug, we left off our last segment. We want to wrap up that a little bit, talking about the Hyksos and Amos. Please tell the audience about that a little more.
Yeah, so it was at that time, in about 1560 BC, when the Hyksos were chased out and the Israelites were put into bondage, which means that it was about 114 years of slavery out of the 430 years that they were there. So this oppression began under Amos's reign, but during the time that he became what we know of now as the first king of the 18th dynasty. So same king, and there's just this easy transition from dynasty 17 to 18. And that's when the oppression started for the Israelites.
Okay, very good. And that again is that reference you brought up in the first chapter of Exodus, a Pharaoh who did not know of Joseph. This is the one you're identifying with that. It's just to make sure I have that correct.
That's absolutely right.
Okay, so that fits one of the criteria that we have to talk about, because there's a lot of criteria to find the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's one of them. You want to find out who that is. Another, criteria that we have to deal with is sort of how the Pharaoh fits with the life of Moses. We know that he murdered an Egyptian at the age of 40 and took off for Midian. So let's talk about that a little bit and just share your insights with the audience, please.
Sure, Henry. He had to be the father or the predecessor. It didn't have to be the father, but the predecessor of the Exodus Pharaoh had to have a long reign, and he was reigning while Moses was exiled in Midian for over 40 years. So Moses fled from this unnamed Pharaoh who sought to execute him for killing an Egyptian, and we know that according to Exodus 2, departing from Egypt when Moses was fulfilling 40 years of age, according to Acts 7:23. Well, only after 40 years had passed, according to Acts 7:30, did the burning bush incident occur, which was immediately following the statement that in the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died. And we find that in Exodus 2:23. So what does that all add up to? How does the math work? Well, Moses died when he was 120 years old, according to Deuteronomy 34. Therefore, according to Moses' biography, the Pharaoh who preceded the Exodus Pharaoh must have ruled beyond 40 years. And there are only two candidates within dynasties 18 and 19 who fit this bill. One of them is Thutmose III, as the predecessor to the Exodus Pharaoh. The other is Ramses II. So only these two men fit this biblical requirement.
Yeah, and it seems very logical to me from reading the text that's right on the money. We believe the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore that is our guide into leading us who the Exodus Pharaoh is. So we're going to skip over the arguments why the 13th century Pharaoh doesn't work. We did that in a couple previous episodes with your colleague Scott Stripling and my friend, our colleague together. So let's talk about Thutmose III a little bit, since he was so important in this time.
Sure. And Thutmose III, he was he was called the Napoleon of Egypt by many modern scholars. It's because during his reign, he launched 17 military campaigns into the Levant, and the land of Israel is part of the Levant. It's the southern Levant. So during these campaigns, he was attacking cities and overcoming city-states and kings that were there, but he was pushing all the way against the borders of his ancient rival, Mitanni. So there were two superpowers of the day, Mitanni and Egypt. And he demonstrated during these 17 campaigns that he was the greater of the two superpowers. It's kind of like the U.S. and Russia, or the Soviet Union back in the day.
Yeah,
they were competing with one another to be the greater superpower. And Egypt was the greater superpower. We know this from the campaign that he launched in his 33rd year when he went into Mitanni's territory. He went all the way to the Euphrates River, and he took his forces down the Euphrates River, sacking and burning cities along the way. And he demonstrated that Egypt was the most powerful ancient empire.
That certainly fits the bill, and not only in terms of the chronology that you laid out, but just the general sense you get from the text of what's happening in Egypt during that time period. Now, another piece of criteria that we have, we got about 2 minutes for this one, you could just lay this out a little bit, is the fact that the firstborn son of the Pharaoh has to die. So we have that issue. So whoever we identify as the Exodus Pharaoh, his firstborn son cannot assume the throne because he's dead from the Exodus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the firstborn son of Amenhotep II, as far as we know, he never gets onto the throne. So who is the eldest son? Well, the Egyptians, they were very careful about documenting things, and one of the things that they did is they made sure to list whoever was the king's eldest son. So this was a very important term, and Thutmose IV, who is the the Pharaoh that followed Amenhotep II, he never claimed to be the king's eldest son. And we know from an inscription that's on the paws of the Sphinx that he never had that distinction. And no other document throughout Egypt's history shows that he has made such a claim. There's one possibility that exists for the oldest son of Amenhotep II, and that is that he was a man named Thutmose. And a renowned Egyptologist named Donald Redford has suggested that probably this Thutmose died in infancy, which would, of course, fit the biblical description perfectly because he never rises to such a position. But there is a statement made that a certain tutor of a man named Thutmose claims to be the tutor of the king's eldest son, and so probably this is the Thutmose that is the child who died at the time of the 10th plague on Egypt.
Well, that's excellent. We're going to actually, in our next segment, develop that a little bit more because you're just sort of getting into that description. And this is a really important part of the criteria for the Exodus Pharaoh. Again, the firstborn son explicitly dies in the biblical text, and that fits part of the criteria. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. Dr. Doug Petrovich is with us. We're very excited to have him with us because he's an expert in these matters and has identified Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and we'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Welcome back to Digging for Truth. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, we think it was Amenhotep II, and Doug Petrovich, who has made the case for this Pharaoh as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, is with us today to lay out the evidence. Now, Doug, we were talking about the death of the firstborn. This is a key component of all this and really a critical part of the criteria. You already talked about Thutmose III having that long reign before while Moses is in Midian, but now we have this other criteria. Let's talk about it a little bit further, this inscription that you mentioned about the Sphinx and so on. I'll let you run with that, please.
Yeah, so this is called the Dream Stella, and it's located between the paws of the Sphinx. And it very clearly makes the argument, first of all, it describes who Thutmose IV was and makes it clear that he was not the king's eldest son. So that important title that this Pharaoh, this firstborn son of Egypt's Pharaoh would always take for himself, that title was one that was never included. But yeah, there is the statement in Exodus 4:22 where it says, "I will kill your son, your firstborn." So according to this verse, the king's eldest son had to die during this 10th plague on Egypt when this destroyer came to kill the firstborn of every person and every domesticated animal throughout Egypt, from the king on the throne all the way down to the prisoner in the jail.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, it's sobering, but again, the trail of evidence and the work that you've done in investigating this really makes Amenhotep II, he fits the bill here. The son, his successor, Thutmose IV, not his firstborn son, and so on. Okay, so now, in terms of the Red Sea incident that occurs, a lot of people have the perception that the Pharaoh dies in the Red Sea. In fact, the old movie, The Ten Commandments, they actually get it right. Ramses goes back to his capital. Wrong Pharaoh, but he went back. He didn't drown in the sea.
Right.
Your argument is that the biblical text actually doesn't say that, and I'd like you to share that with the audience to look carefully at the text. Please do that, Doug.
Sure. So it kind of works like this, Henry. Like most of you, I'm guessing, or many of you, you learned as a child in Sunday school that the Pharaoh died with his army in the Red Sea. But ultimately, when I realized that Amenhotep II lived beyond 1446 BC, which is the year of the Exodus, he lived long beyond it. He lived into at least his 26th year. And I accept the argumentation that he lived into into the 30s. So it was beyond 30 years, well beyond 30 years. What do you do with the text then? If he lives this long, does he really die? So being that, of course, I'm a teacher of Hebrew language, ancient Hebrew Bible, I decided I'm going to look at this more carefully. So I looked at some of the passages that talk about this. For example, Psalm 106:11, where it reads, "Then the water covered their adversaries, not one of them remained." So according to many people, allegedly Pharaoh, as the chief adversary, was among the slain Egyptians who died in this debacle in the water. But if Amenhotep II actually was the Exodus Pharaoh, then his reign would have ended abruptly during the year of the Exodus, or 1446.
Right.
But really, Psalm 106:11 never specifically mentions Pharaoh. So there's no reason to conclude that he drowned with his army. Only those Egyptian adversaries, as national representatives, who chased the Israelites into the sea, were consumed by the water. And since they were the task force dispatched on this mission, their defeat signals the demise of the entire nation. So we can understand the verse in that light.
Yeah, it's very helpful. And the other verse is Psalm 136:15. And here you know, an article that you wrote years ago, you really do great work on explaining this to the reader. When I read through that, it just totally convinced me of your argument. But I'd like you to explain that instead of me doing that.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite verses to address, Henry. And of course, it's not a firsthand witness, right? The firsthand witness is Exodus 14:28 and that context. And it never says there that the Pharaoh died in the sea with his army. But the proof text that's used is Psalm 136:15, where it says, "But he overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Sea of Reeds, for his steadfast love endures forever." So literally, the term there for overthrew is not actually overthrowing, like destroying or killing. It's he shook off. So the Hebrew verb actually states that God shook off the powerful Pharaoh and his army, who were like bothersome pests that God, decided need to just be brushed away. And that same Hebrew verb is used in Psalm 109:23, where it says, where David actually laments, he says, "I am gone like a shadow when it lengthens. I am shaken off like the locust." So here David's describing this sad condition of his suffering, right? The picture painted by the verb is that David had become like a locust that casually is flicked away from a person's garment. Well, David certainly was not describing his own demise or his death.
Yeah.
So Psalm 136:15 does not teach that the Exodus Pharaoh died alongside his army. They were just flicked off like a locust from somebody's shoulder.
Yeah, like here's God and here's the Pharaoh, kind of going like that. It's really an amazing picture. When I first read your article about that, I almost laughed because of the arrogance of man lifted up against the Lord God of the universe. Well, Doug, believe it or not, we are running out of time here in our first segment. We got a lot more to talk about. We want to invite folks to come back. I'll give you just 1 minute. Sorry to do it. You got 1 minute just to sort of sum up what we talked about so far.
Sure. We've identified the time period where the Israelites moved to Egypt, which was the 12th dynasty, and that's 1876 BC. And they prospered there with these two businesses, one being the turquoise mines and the other being the wine trading industry with huge huge containers of wine that were shipped in from Canaan. And then the Egyptians, of course, were overtaken in the north by the Hyksos, and the Hyksos lived there 108 years. And then this Pharaoh who doesn't know of Joseph comes in from Thebes, from southern Egypt. He comes in, he overtakes them, and the Israelite enslavement begins, and it works its way down to Thutmose III, the predecessor to the Exodus Pharaoh, and then to Amenhotep II, who is the Exodus Pharaoh himself.
Well, that's excellent. And on top of that, we can say that the Pharaoh didn't necessarily die in the Red Sea. Doug, thank you for joining us for this episode. We're looking forward to having you back for part 2.
Thank you, Henry.
Appreciate you very much. Friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We're just getting started here showing evidence related to the Exodus Pharaoh. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we hope you come back for part 2. And thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth.